Welcome everyone that is joining us. Thanks for being here. Give it a few more moments before we start, but just to briefly introduce myself, my name is Evan Smith. My pronouns are they, them, or he, him. I am a community organizer at Marijuana Justice. Happy to have you all here today. We have two amazing presenters here to speak with us today about all things cannabis and marijuana and keeping our community safe. We have Don Blagrove, Executive Director at Emancipate NC, and Chelsea Higgs-Wise, Executive Director at Marijuana Justice. Just as a brief kind of logistics to lay the land for today, they're going to each have a presentation that they'll share. Feel free to enter any questions and comments in the chat. We will document all of those. We have a lot to talk about today, especially given the news from last week from the nation's capital. So we'll have a question and answer section after each presentation itself. And if we have any time at the end, we'll try to do any other questions and comments as well. So thanks again, everyone, for coming out today. And we'll try to reach out over email after this session if there's anything that we need to tie up as far as questions that we're not able to get to. So to start, I want to welcome Don Blagrove. Welcome, Don. Thanks so much for being here. Looking forward to learning more about Don't Plead the Weed today.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here, and we're going to jump right in. I'm just going to start sharing my screen so that we can get as much covered as we possibly can. All right. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so this campaign is, again, my name is Dawn Blagrove. I am the Executive Director of Emancipate NC. We are based in Durham, North Carolina, but we're a statewide organization that is committed to ending systemic and institutional racism, abolishing the carceral system, and ending mass incarceration. So one of the campaigns that we've used to develop to help try to curb mass incarceration is Don't Plead to Weed. So I know many of you, and we'll touch on it a little bit more later, possibly, but many of you are have heard the news that President Biden has decided to issue a pardon for folks on the federal level and in DC who were convicted of personal possession amounts of marijuana. And he is calling on governors statewide or countrywide to do the same thing. I'm in North Carolina. Our governor has intimated that he is looking into the possibility of doing this. But I think that until we get more details, I had a law school professor who used to say all the time that the devil was in the details. So until we get more details, it is imperative that all of us move and act as though nothing has actually changed. So Don't Plead to Weed is the campaign that we're talking about here today. And it is a way for Emancipate NC to talk to folks about the proliferation of justice-involved people who get there through marijuana and cannabis convictions. What we know for sure is that it is absolutely a product. These arrests and convictions and the rates of the arrests and convictions are a product of mass incarceration and of systemic and institutional racism within our judicial system. That cannabis and weed is less dangerous than alcohol, but it's criminalized, again, because it is criminalized in a way that is xenophobic and racist. The smell of weed is an excuse for police to harass Black and brown people and search their cars. But what we all know and what we'll know moving forward is that weed and cannabis smell exactly the same, look exactly the same. And there is no real way for a law enforcement officer or anyone to be able to appreciably discern the difference between what is legal hemp or cannabis and what is illegal marijuana. And because of that, nobody should be getting prosecuted for smell or even possession, especially because in North Carolina, at least our SBI, our state Bureau of Investigation lab, has made it clear and even issued a memo saying that they do not have any way to test small amounts of marijuana to determine, or small amounts of cannabis to determine whether or not it is marijuana or it is hemp. And as a result of that, the state cannot carry the burden of these charges. So this campaign is really about making sure that that the people understand how you can protect your own rights and how you can make sure that you are not making the case for the state and you are making them earn any conviction for low-level marijuana or cannabis possession. All right, so let's just talk about the numbers. So by the numbers, in every single state, Black people are more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession, despite the fact that marijuana is used across the board on an equal basis. So Black people do not have the corner marketed on use of marijuana, possession of marijuana. However, we do seem to have the corner marketed on arrests and convictions for marijuana. Over 300,000 people are arrested for weed charges in North Carolina alone annually. The majority of those people are Black. In 2020 in New York City, for example, 94% of people arrested for weed were Black. In Wisconsin, where I grew up, Black Wisconsinites are 4.3 times more likely than their white counterparts to be convicted of using marijuana. And this is just really a brief overview and a quick dip into the numbers, just to help you see how grossly disproportionate marijuana charges are and convictions are for Black and brown communities. So what's the big picture? The big picture is that in North Carolina, the state crime lab cannot tell the difference between illegal weed and legal hemp. They are both cannabis. The state has to pay for a very expensive private lab test to prove the difference. So unless you are dealing with amounts of marijuana or amounts of cannabis that are large enough to be considered trafficking, the state is not going to pay for these expensive tests to determine whether or not there is cannabis or hemp in the possession of whomever was arrested. The state just doesn't have the money for that. And just before we go any further, I want to talk about what it is that they're actually testing for, because it's important for us to understand. Illegal weed has more than 0.3% of THC, okay? Legal hemp has less than 0.3% of THC. Now, THC, and I am no chemist, make no mistake, I went to law school for a reason, but just so you understand, THC is the compound that makes you get high, right? When you are using or smoking cannabis, right? It is the thing that makes you feel euphoric. Okay, so the difference between illegal weed and legal hemp is simply how much of that euphoric compound is inside of the leaf that you are smoking or partaking in, okay? Once again, in order to determine how much THC is inside of whatever cannabis leaf that you have, or cannabis product that you have for that matter, the state and most states have to use a very, very expensive test. They just aren't going to do it. And in North Carolina, they've issued a whole memo saying, the state has issued a whole memo saying they're not going to test. They're just not going to do it. What that means is that if you get charged with possession of what is purported to be illegal weed, the state has the burden of proving that that substance has more THC than is legally allowed. And if it is in a small portion of marijuana that you have been caught with, the state simply will not be able to make that burden unless you make it for them. So now let's get to the good stuff. Again, CBD won't get you high, right? I mean, it will, I guess maybe it will get you high, I don't know. It's often used to help reduce inflammation and pain. It may also help ease nausea, migraine, seizures, and anxiety. So CBD has it's become commonplace that we all understand that CBD has medicinal purposes and is legal, can be legally sold everywhere in the United States. THC, again, is the thing that makes you feel high, right? So the difference between what is legal cannabis and what is illegal marijuana is that THC content, okay? So let's talk about hemp versus marijuana. Hemp is a cannabis that contains very little THC, right? Less than 0.3% THC is the legal threshold for hemp. Hemp growers are under very strict regulations as to how much how much THC can be produced in the hemp that they grow. Marijuana, on the other hand, which is also cannabis, both hemp and marijuana both derive from the cannabis plant, but marijuana contains a much higher THC level. And really, it doesn't really matter how much higher it is, as long as it's more than 0.3%, then it is going to be considered marijuana, i.e. illegal. So how do we avoid not pleading to weed? Because here's the thing, y'all. We don't want you to plead guilty to marijuana charges because the state has to prove the burden that the marijuana or the substance that you have, that the cannabis that you have, has a high enough level of THC to be illegal. And what I'm telling you, and what we know for sure, is that it is incredibly expensive and difficult for the state, any state, to determine whether or not the cannabis that you were charged with criminally is actually an illegal substance. So there are some ways, though, to get around that, right? There are some ways for the state to get those convictions. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how you can avoid that. Number one, is protect your own rights, okay? So when you get pulled over by the police, if you're in your car, when you get stopped by the police, if you are walking down the street, when you interact with law enforcement, and you or someone around you has been partaking in cannabis, they can smell it on your clothes, they can smell it on you. You may even be holding something in your hand, right? What I need for you all to do is to shut up, okay? Don't say anything. The vast majority of the time, police will ask you, law enforcement will ask you, are you smoking weed? Right? Is that weed? Give me that weed. If you respond in the affirmative to any of those questions, you are in essence doing the state's job for them. You are admitting that what you have has more THC than is legally allowed. Now, let me just be clear. I'm not telling you to lie to the police, even though, whatever, that's up to you. I'm not telling you to lie, because the reality is you don't even know how much THC is in the cannabis that you have in your possession. You do not know. And because you don't know, you should be quiet. Don't say anything. Don't admit to anything. Later on, we're going to offer you a wallet card that has some rights. So if you feel like you one of them kind of people that just can't be quiet, just can't not say nothing, pull out this wallet card, pull it up on your phone, take a picture of it, and read what is on the card. Nothing more and nothing less. You have to offer, if you're driving a car and you're pulled over, you have to offer your driver's license. You have to provide proof of identity. But other than that, zip it, okay? Don't prove their case for them. That's how you protect your own rights. Tip number 2, make them prove it. You have to go to trial. Force the state to get that very expensive chemical analysis of the substance to prove that there is more than 0.3 THC in it. I guarantee you they won't do it. I mean, they might, I don't know. You might be a big old pain in the ass and they might just might have it in for you. So they could do it, but don't make it hard. Don't make it easy for them. Make it hard. Do not admit that what you have is marijuana. Don't say anything to law enforcement. Don't offer any extemporaneous information, none. But if you do get charged, make sure you tell your attorney you want to take it to trial. Don't plead guilty to those charges. Now, let me add a caveat here. I am saying to you, do not plead guilty. However, it is imperative that you do what is best for you. In some jurisdictions, you will have district attorneys who will offer deferment, right? Like if you do some kind of drug treatment plan, they'll dismiss the charge. It'll be like it never happened. That may be what works best for you. Go ahead and do that. But if you are not being offered a way to get rid of those charges so they do not remain on your permanent record, I need for you to go ahead and make them prove it. Make the state prove that what you have in your possession is actually illegal marijuana and not legal hemp, okay? As long as you don't admit to anything, they have to prove it. That's why it is so important that you protect your rights. Be quiet, zip it. Don't say anything to the police. Don't offer anything to the police. Don't respond to any of their questions. Do not convict yourself. That is how you protect your rights. But also, again, when you get, if you get arrested, if you have to go to court on this, and if you have not proven the case already for the state by admitting that you have marijuana, because see, that's the magic word. Don't say marijuana, because that is the thing that is illegal. Hemp, cannabis are legal in these United States of America. So I would encourage all of you to remove the word weed from your vocabulary completely. Because the truth of the matter is, no matter what you have, you don't actually know how much THC is in it. So you don't even actually know if you have weed. But what you do have for sure is cannabis, which is a legal substance in North Carolina and in these United States of America. So eliminate the word weed from your vocabulary completely. Embrace or marijuana from your vocabulary completely, because marijuana has a very specific legal connotation. And if you say that you have marijuana, if you say that you have weed, what you are actually doing is admitting to having an illegal substance. Don't do that. Number 3, smell does not equal guilt. I said this earlier, but I want to reiterate it. Hemp and marijuana burn exactly the same. They smell exactly the same. They look exactly the same. There is no way for a law enforcement officer to be able to discern from smell or from sight the difference between hemp, cannabis, or illegal marijuana. They are going to make assumptions that it is illegal marijuana. They are going to say to you that it is illegal marijuana. What I need for you to do, again, remove the word marijuana, remove the words weed from your vocabulary, because you don't know if what you have is that. And by stating that you believe what you have is that, you are admitting guilt, okay? So just because they smell marijuana, just because they smell what smells like marijuana, just because they see what looks like marijuana, that is not enough. Law enforcement cannot discernibly tell the difference, nor can anyone else, between what is legal and what is illegal, okay? Number 4, again, do what's best for you. I already said this, but I want to reiterate it. In many counties and in many jurisdictions, you can get a deferred prosecution for first-time misdemeanor weed charges, okay? That may be your best option, right? If you can get a deferred prosecution, if this is your first time, if you can go through, you could do some community service hours and make this thing go away, that is best. ultimately, the goal of the Don't Plead to Weed campaign is for you not to get caught up in the criminal justice system because of weed, because of cannabis, because of hemp. That is what we are trying to avoid. So many Black and brown folks, their very first conviction and their entryway into the criminal justice system is associated with low-level cannabis possession. So what we're trying to do is make sure that you do not enter the judicial system, that you do not end up branded with that stamp of being convicted of a crime if you don't have to, right? And that's how we work to fight against mass incarceration. That's what this whole campaign is about. So do what's best for you. If you got to fight it at trial, that's great. And let's do it. And you can win as long as you've protected your rights and followed the other 3 tips. But if you get offered a deferred prosecution where you can do some community service, or you can go through some kind of drug class or something, and these charges go away, that works too. The ultimate goal here is not to end up with a criminal record related to cannabis, hemp, or marijuana charges. That is the goal of this, right? How you get there is up to you. You decide how you get there. And there is no right or wrong way how to get there, as long as on the other side of this experience, you've avoided creating a longer or a first-time criminal record for yourself. Many attorneys, defense attorneys, public defenders are going to advise you straight out the gate to plead guilty to this charge. Don't do that. Don't listen to them. Instead, what I want you to do is direct your attorneys to the website don'tpleadtoweed.com, where they will be able to find a plethora of resources to help them fight this charge and help you and future clients understand that it is not a given that you should plead to weed. Not only is it not a given, it is actually borderline malpractice unless your client has not followed tip number 1 and boop, zipped it, right? But as long as you protect your own rights, as long as you do not say more than you need to say to law enforcement, as long as you do not admit to having illegal marijuana or weed. And again, we're taking that term out of our vocabulary. We're not saying weed, we're not saying marijuana. We are only talking about cannabis and hemp, because here's the reality, my friends. Even you don't know how much THC is in whatever it is that you are partaking in. You don't know definitively. And because you don't know definitively, I want you to stop using terms that have real negative meanings, like marijuana, like weed. Embrace hemp, embrace cannabis, okay? Because for all you know, that's what you have. And again, the website for you to direct your attorneys to is don'tpleadtoweed.com, where they will be able to find resources about how to successfully defend against marijuana charges in cases where their client, that's you, has not admitted to having marijuana or weed in their possession. So know your rights. If you're stopped or pulled over by the police, you can pull up our digital card to remind you of your rights. Simply repeat what is on the card to protect yourself. The best thing for you to do is say nothing. But if you feel compelled to speak, do not speak without pulling up this digital card. Take a picture of it on your phone, whatever the case may be, and read the words on the card, nothing more, nothing less. This is the card. Now, these are a lot of words. I will give you that. These are a lot of words. And in the first time I did this presentation in the community, so community folks pulled my skirt and was like, ma'am, I ain't getting through all them words before the cops gonna pull me out my car. And that might be true. But understand, in essence, what this says is you do not wish to speak or answer any questions. You are exercising your Fifth Amendment right under the Constitution to remain silent and not to incriminate yourself. That you want to speak to your lawyer before you answer any questions, and that you do not, under any circumstances, give permission to search your car, your bags, your person, or your home. That's what this card says. So, to wrap it up, before deciding to plead guilty, a person facing criminal charges for illegal marijuana should be aware of the following things. You have a right to force the state of North Carolina or whatever state you are in to obtain a chemical analysis of the substance that they are claiming to be marijuana. The state's responsibility is to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that whatever this substance is contains more than 0.3% THC. What we know for sure is that the vast majority of the crime labs in America do not have the capacity to determine how much THC is in personal amounts of marijuana. As a result, the state cannot prove its case. Now, for felonies like trafficking, the state will pay for that lab test. So if you have large quantities of hemp or cannabis, I want you to rethink some of this, okay? Because they will test if it's a large enough amount, all right? They will pay for that expensive test. But most of the time, what we are talking about is small quantities that are for personal use. And if you have a small quantity that is for personal use, the chances are that your state lab will not and cannot afford the test to determine how much THC is in there. So as long as you don't tell them that what you have is marijuana or weed, as long as you don't admit to having committed a crime and you force the state to prove its case, you will beat these charges. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you guys so much for your time and for listening.
Thanks so much, Dawn. I did not see any questions in the chat, so if anyone has any, please type those in, and we'll move on to Chelsea's presentation, and we'll do a joint question and answer at the very end if time allows. And if not, then we will get back to you afterwards. So thanks so much, Dawn, for helping us learn more about how to not plead to weed. And now we are welcoming Chelsea Higgs-Wise, Executive Director at Marijuana Justice. And give me a second as I share my screen.
And actually, Evan, why don't we wait on the share of the screen? I'm actually going to switch up my approach, and I'm going to, number one, thank Dawn for really just sharing with us how we can keep ourselves safe as individuals, right? There's this personal safety, there's this community interpersonal safety that we do with one another. And with these types of advice and being able to know what's legal and what's not, you're able to keep yourself safer, right? And that's really what the conversation that we're having today about. And yes, we are talking about, some specifics, some legal language, but the idea here is that the more we are learning together, the more we can keep each other safe, and we can think of new ways to keep each other safe, because the card is a brilliant idea. It's a new idea, and these will be more things that we can learn together. The really significant thing that brings Dawn and I together is that we are in the South. We're located here, as well as Evan, along with our organization. We're in Virginia. Dawn is in North Carolina. And this is going to impact our folks very differently based on our place, our space, and our history. And we heard a little bit from Dawn about that, about her governor's reaction. And I'm going to give a little bit about our local reaction here and how we've kind of stepped into this role in Virginia a couple years ago. But I do want to now take us on to a larger community approach to safety, and now really looking at two different approaches that we have of organizing. which is, again, learning together, learning from our experiences, allowing that to now take us into how does that influence the decision makers, and really rile up our community to build a base to move forward what we want when it comes to cannabis. I am really excited about all of the questions, the curiosity after President Biden's latest announcement. I know Dawn mentioned it a little bit earlier, but in case you weren't around last week or you've had a busy life, you might have missed out on exactly what happened. So I'm going to go through a little bit of those specifics because it's going to be important that we know one way that we do this at a federal level now that Biden has opened that door, and now what we can do at the state level. And I'm going to use Virginia as that model and example, and really talking to us specifically that care and have grown from the South, and how we can move forward as we're continuing these conversations, right? So last Thursday around 3:30, I know because I was sitting on a panel when all of my notifications started to go off, President Biden tweeted and sent out a press release about granting federal pardons for simple possession marijuana at the federal level. So this is really the first time that he's acknowledged and making concrete moves. He admits and acknowledges the reality that there are clear racial disparities in marijuana weed enforcement, and now taking this first step to pardon simple marijuana possession. He's also, the second piece is that he's telling the states, as Dawn mentioned, to now do this yourselves. Like he's putting that onus on the government, on the governor. And I'm going to also talk about later how that puts the fight and the labor in the people, right? And now finally, what President Biden also tweeted on Thursday and put out the release was that he's finally getting his administration to now look at marijuana being a Schedule I drug and the Controlled Substances Act. So I'm going to touch on that, what that is in just a second. So I have been saying since Thursday that this is a very meaningful gesture that the president has done. Okay, this will improve the lives of a few hundred, maybe thousands people. There has been a number out there of 6,500 people with federal crimes over the last few years. What a lot of stories have not been clarifying is that over 90% of those federal charges are on people that are not citizens of the United States. And one of the exclusions, per usual with drug policy in general, are folks that are not US citizens are left out any of the protections. And that is no different in what happened with President Biden on Thursday. So if I can do math, and I took out my phone that has everything, including a calculator, and I did the math, and 90% means about 600 or so people will now actually feel the benefit through those instead of the thousands. When I was able to look at some of the data, most of the charges were coming from the border around Arizona specifically. And as I've been also reminding people, simple possession on the federal level is illegal no matter what the threshold or the amount. So it's really important to realize the fact that simple possession is still going to be criminalized. Yes, even after Biden pardoned people. He did something for past offenses, but what about upcoming? But it's really important to understand, without completely descheduling marijuana, no longer criminalizing it in this way, that's the way to really protect people at all levels, including those that may not have the right citizenship papers, because any amount of marijuana possession will then automatically trigger a possible deportation. And marijuana is number 4 reason for deportation within this country. So that was the biggest part that hit me, knowing that this will essentially help a very few handful of people, but I am excited for that. it will help with the collateral consequences. So this is another thing that people have needed to digest a little bit more with these pardons, right? Like, what does that actually look like? What is now the safety protection that's coming from that? Is that folks with these federal simple possession charges will now have that barrier removed for possible employment, housing, financial aid, education, but they will still have a criminal conviction, okay? So the courts, the cops, the prosecutors will still be able to see this charge. And remember, it's really a charge against people without citizenship. That's why they named it and really racialized the word marijuana, because it's targeting from folks from the South, Mexican, particularly those of Mexican descent and Mexicans that were here. And so this was always been used, as we know, from Nixon's advisor that admitted this, right? We can, if you want to Google that information tidbit about Nixon's advisor admitting that the drug war was always a way to get Black people, brown people, and I guess progressive hippies. He did not use those words, but I will not repeat what he used. But this tool that happened 50 years ago is still continuing with this federal prohibition. And why descheduling? It must happen. Now, my last point here about the federal piece with Biden is what he did not say is that he did not say anything to Congress about passing decriminalization language, right? I mean, that is how we have to go forward. We need to expunge all of these federal convictions. If we are able to decriminalize and maybe even legalize in a way that brings money to the states to help fund the criminal justice parts like expungement. If you're in that expungement reform work, you know, legislators and governors have just said it's too expensive to update our systems and do automatic expungement. So this word about money could also be, this barrier of money could also be addressed here. But I really just have to just continue to say, I've been really about the 3Ds since, thank you, Dawn, with the, if you want to check the chat about Nixon's comments about the war on drugs. I've really been repeating the 3Ds. If anybody uses these, you want to just credit me a little bit, but I think these Ds are really important of decriminalize, deschedule. Decriminalize is what Congress can do. Deschedule is what the administration and Biden can do. And we also have to decarcerate, right? This is what our DOC has to do. So when we're looking at the federal pieces, we've got to ask ourselves, is that happening? And that's really where we need to continue to go. Really quickly, without descheduling, people will still face criminal consequences. Non-citizens will still face that automatic threat. Something that we didn't talk about with Biden is anybody that has a state level offense will still have their, like when they have federal checks done, they'll still be barred from things because of their state level offense, right? So just realizing for folks that this is truly a nice gesture, but it is a far move forward for Biden as the author, one of the authors of the crime bill in 1994 and sitting on that committee that pushed this information forward and pushed this drug war forward. So I will say that he has come a long way from just saying that we need to study it. But we have a long way to go. So that is my quick run down and dirty of what happened on Thursday, as well as what we need to do. If you have any other questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat or email me later as you think of them. And I will love to address those. Now I'm going to ask for Evan, my colleague, to share the slides. As I mentioned before, that I am really a lover of teaching and learning with community about how we can create safety methods. And a lot of times that means using our power to create the world we want to live in, and even what the laws feel like, right? So that's really what we do. And we do that with our coalition. We're excited in Virginia to say that we're part of the Joint Canna Justice Coalition. It contains us, Marijuana Justice, Rise for Youth. Yes, that is an organization with youth of 18 and under, particularly because we know how the drug war impacts young people. And that is something that all of us have to keep in mind as we are talking about repealing the prohibition. How has the drug war leaked into the juvenile justice codes, right? When it could be more about health, maybe safety, maybe some treatment, right? But we don't have to have cages for our youth. We can give them care. And speaking of that, we have Virginia Student Power Network. They are in Virginia and they have chapters all over the college campuses. So working with folks that are young, but also a lot of those members are between the ages of 18 and 24, which we know, particularly in Virginia, but across this United States, are the target range for marijuana possession charges. Over half of the marijuana charges in Virginia, the last 3 decades prior to decriminalization, were of 18 to 24-year-olds, over half. And you look further into that information in young men and boys. And so it's really important that we have that group as part of our coalition and continuing to inform us of what we need to do to keep us safe. And finally, we have Justice for Virginia. They are a group of public defenders that just show up and help us with the legal part, with a lot of any other policy pieces that are just outside of our scope. But it's really great to have them there as a everyday talk about the carceral system. And to be very honest, when we talk about keeping us safe and organizing in this way, a safety method we use is we don't ever talk to the cops. I'm not talking to the prosecutors, but I can get my buddies over at Justice Forward, the public defenders, to go take those meetings and have those conversations. And so I also really respect the boundaries of community members not meeting with carceral actors, of cops, prosecutors, and judges. A lot of times that just doesn't make people safe, and we're already so much over surveilled in these areas. All right, next slide. Really quickly, how we, now that I'm talking at the state level, right, I just talked about what we need to do to keep us safe at the federal level, what we need to push for as our power. Now I'm looking at the state level, and I'm just really giving this example of what we did in Virginia and what we still have to do. But the first step is really find your problem. And in Virginia, we were looking at the racial disparities because we are part of the South. We do have a number of Black folks. About 20% of Virginia is African American, but yet we were still 3.4 times more likely than white people to be convicted as well as arrested for these marijuana crimes. So I show this slide from ACLU Virginia. This is a resource that maybe we can drop into. It's the Tale of Two Countries report that they put out for 2020, very cute. And it goes state by state. So really working with organizers across the country, I say, look up your state's data. ACLU has done some of this very top level work for you to just inform yourself, but also validate your community's experiences. So many people I talk to about, weed and just walking around and enforcement is that they just feel like, I knew I did it wrong. I was doing something wrong. I don't want to talk about it. They do not feel justified in knowing that this drug war was always targeting them, whether they were in proximity to weed or not, right? They're just really coming after Blackness as a way to criminalize us. But so we started with the problem. We ranked 27 in disparities. We had a 33% increase in the last 3 decades of marijuana possession arrests. So all of a sudden in law enforcement, there was this increase of arrests and motivation to arrest. And unfortunately, with the world and political climate that we've been living in the last few years, this is also what we've seen across the board of criminalization. Next slide. So what we did is that we had to then really now validate our stories to the decision makers and find different ways and tools to validate our experiences. And sometimes that comes with numbers. And so we were able to really propose a study with a legislator that had been following our work for a while, and they had the General Assembly look at how to legalize marijuana, and included in that we had specific asks that were carried on through legislation to look at the racial impacts, to look at the criminal justice ways, the reparative models that could happen. And a huge piece that came out of it is that the arrests were still happening at such a rate that really could not be explained by any other reason except for racism. And so, yes, we have this data, right? Like we have this report, but I think it's really important for people to know that it took voices and it took organizing and it took people sharing their authentic feelings with one another, but with decision makers, for them to see that these numbers that they were reading were actual lives at stake. And for them to continue to ignore this really did not make sense. So then in 2021, the Virginia Governor Report proposes now the Virginia as a state. The former governor of Virginia, Governor Northam, actually did propose, after reading this study that we had done in 2020, after hearing voices, he came back and said, well, in 2021, we're going to come and we're going to legalize marijuana. Next slide. He really did say, we're going to legalize it, and we're going to legalize it with racial disparities and equity in mind. Now, I understand as a Southern state, we did have a Democratic governor, and even, party, whatever you are on the scale, being in the South and having a governor come out and say this was pretty revolutionary. And I do want to remind folks that there was also a lot happening there, is that the community members were still really voicing their anger about the revelation of his medical school yearbook and his college yearbook that showed him or a friend, someone on his yearbook page in blackface in a KKK outfit. And there was a picture of him in the yearbook fully shown with his nickname as Poon Man. So there was a lot happening in Virginia. But I also bring that up not to bring up shame anyone's past, but to really just talk about the power of people's authentic reactions and their demands that said, all right, well, you stayed around in office and we actually have something that you can do that we've been working on, that we believe in, that we can make change right now, right? We may not change the governor's heart, but we can change our living conditions. So what we had to continue to do is continue to prove that we need it. So even after Virginia said they wanted to, y'all, and organizers that hear this, we know that even after they say they want to do something, a lot of times they still won't do it in the way that we are demanding. And so we continued to work, and we knew that in 2020, Virginia had decriminalized marijuana, which means that no one would go to jail for simple possession, but was still accruing these civil penalties. So we had a real curiosity of like, well, who's still getting these civil penalties? Who's getting that ticket, right? Like, why is this criminalization still happening at that level, and who's feeling it? So even just after 6 months, while everyone's talking about legalizing, we were like, let's still find a way to validate our voice. And we FOIA'd the information of the arrest from the 6 months from where Virginia had decriminalized the year before. And this slide that you see right now is actually the news article that came out that racial disparities persist after marijuana decriminalization. Now I'm going to stop right there because I do think it's so important to say that title is such a good one for a reporter. So if you're in press narratives, if you're an organizer working with press, like I always use this actually as an example of like, this is how you make a headline, because it spoke directly to our community that we were reaching out, that just wanted this validation. It spoke directly to legislators. It spoke everyone that wants to keep us safe. Well, why is this still happening? So I just really being able to prove this was still happening. And I'm also going to take it back to the federal piece that I talked about earlier, that, if we deschedule and if we decriminalize on the federal level, these racial disparities would not have to be fought like this at the state level, right? We're putting on, this is, just showing you all the different studies, the different ways we've had to validate our voices. This would not be mandated and put on us if this happened at the federal level. And as we talk about the South, I'll get to that in just a second. We have to even talk about how our power has to be used differently in the South. So this is what it looks like in Virginia. Next slide. And so we got together with our crew and we demand the repeal of the prohibition. Very, very particular in that wording. We didn't use decriminalize because people thought we had already did that. You know, but it decriminalize and the state level still actually means like the cops can search you. It still means the cops can write you a ticket. It still means that ticket can end up in a fine that if you can't possibly pay because, I don't know, it's a pandemic, and that fine then goes to collections, and now that collections record stops you from getting an apartment. And, you know, these are things that affect our everyday lives. But as I mentioned before, even with decriminalization in Virginia, folks that are not citizens, that's all they needed for them to get targeted by ICE here in the state of Virginia. And many cities in Virginia do absolutely participate with ICE. So we got together, we chose this repeal the prohibition because we still want to repeal it. And we started this campaign to tell the governor, hey, you might want to legalize in 2024, which means the state gets all sorts of revenue, right? But we need to actually repeal the prohibition right now and stop some of this harm that's going on with law enforcement and arrests. Next slide. Along with this, and I'm not going to go into this too quickly, but along with our demand to repeal the prohibition, we also talked about the banning of pretextual stops. Pretextual stops is included, well, I'll just start that pretextual stops are really hunches that cops have and driven off of, which is mostly racial bias and profiling, right? Especially in traffic laws. So going to the next slide, we actually have examples of what pretextual stops are, right? When you have a tail light, RIP Sandra Bland, license plate lights, brake lights, dangling objects, a loud exhaust, and down at the bottom there, you'll see the smell of marijuana. So we also were able to get passed and get heard through our folks at Justice Forward, so that law enforcement in Virginia can no longer use the smell of marijuana to stop, search, or seize, because again, like Don said earlier, they can't tell the difference, and that was part of that argument. So we're really sharing all of our arguments and our tools for any folks that can then apply that to your area. And Justice Forward is always willing to talk more about their pretextual stops. So if you have questions, we can connect you with them. Next slide. So now we're really at the point of protecting our progress here in Virginia. I'm sorry this slide is so small right here, and maybe it's just my screen, but really quickly that just 1 year later, not even a full year after Virginia did legalize simple possession in 2021. So our campaign worked, the Legalize It Right work. It did actually come around, as that's what makes Virginia the first state in the South to have that. And immediately we had to go into the mode of defense. And because elections happened, Virginia shifted and we had a new governor as well as a new House makeup that's more conservative. And long story short, y'all, the progress that we made in 2021 of repealing the prohibition of simple possession was really challenged this year, and we understand it's going to continue to be challenged. So our governor actually created a new crime at the misdemeanor possession level. And this is one of those nuanced words, simple possession versus regular possession. What does it mean? It's all very complicated on purpose, but the fact that they are creating these new crimes means that they are looking for ways to continue to criminalize weed, cannabis, even as they talk about Virginia adult use sales and collecting more revenue. Next slide. Release and resentencing is one of the pieces that we are really looking at, because even though Virginia has legalized simple possession, we have not let anyone free. Next slide, I'm going to rush through these just because. But it's also on here too of what we have to continue to do, right? We have to release our people. We have to look at the family regulation agencies that are still separating families for the testing of marijuana and CPS and DSS. We have to look at land and climate protections, particularly in like the Arizona, Texas area, about land rights and water rights. Immigration enforcement, revenue reinvestment, where does the money go for medical and adult use cannabis, regulation evaluation, making sure we're looking at what we pass and we're not just recriminalizing, but we're actually continuing to try to make it fair. And finally, that juvenile enforcement. So, you know, because of what Biden said in simple possession is a step forward, I never want us to get too comfortable or satisfied yet, because this is list right here is what else we have to do before we even like look at how to sell it. I mean, there are so many different ways that we can be criminalized within these different sectors of work, and all have to do with around decriminalization, descheduling, and decarceration. And that's why the state level has to also be advocating at the federal level in order to keep our larger community safe. Next slide. That's really that for my presentation. I know we've just got a couple minutes left. Does anybody have any questions or any thoughts? I'm going to invite Dawn back on the screen. You know, we have done a couple different iterations of this presentation, and I think right now we're also just looking for other folks in the South that want to continue this work. So please also reach out to us. This is recorded, so please share this out as appropriate with folks. And we're really just ready to take this movement south and get us free. So I'm really excited. Thank you so much for Community Change for having us. Any last words for you, Dawn?
No, thank you so much. Thank you to Community Change, and keep your mouth shut. Don't be talking to the police. Don't talk to the police.
Yes, yes. Well, we are here for a little bit. If anyone does want to stay on and ask any questions, or if you want to email us, we can drop in our email right now if your question is more personal. But we really are excited that folks are excited. And how timely was this, Dawn, with the whole President Biden thing?
It couldn't have been, the timing couldn't have been better.
Yeah. And we know we had a lot more people sign up than it showed up today. So if you're watching this at a different time, thank you for checking in. And we appreciate everybody really committed to this work.
What she said.
Oh. Well, thanks, y'all. And we'll let you go.